This channel is very classic oriented. No matter the game, really. But when it comes to classic Mortal Kombat, there's one question that appears on basically every single video that I put out if it has MK3 in it. And that question is, why doesn't the community just play Trilogy instead? Now, to be fair, it is a perfectly understandable question. Trilogy, whilst releasing later than Ultimate MK3, was still very much a game that was built on what MK3 laid in place. It's almost seen as an expansion for a lot of people because it's got more characters, stages, finishing moves for the hidden characters, pretty much considered by many to be Ultimate MK3, but with more content, right? Well, this video explains in as much detail as I can why even in 2021, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 is still seen as the standard for competitive play, and, maybe more importantly to some of you, why Trilogy is not. This question has many layers to its answer, and it stems beyond the game itself. You have the time period, the community as a whole, controller restrictions, and a lot more. I want to go on record though and say that this video is not an attack on MK Trilogy. It is one of my favourites in the franchise, and I have plenty of great memories from it. The very first thing I need to cover is the idea of accessibility, and how, in competitive games, those seeds are sown early on for communities to be born and to grow. When Mortal Kombat was at its most hardcore competitive back in the 90s, it was arcade culture keeping it going. Everything was on machines. People played on the sticks the machines had, and many hardcore arcade players rarely played on console, or perhaps didn't even own one. When MK Trilogy hit the scene, the PS1 and N64 didn't exactly have the greatest of arcade replica hardware. You take an entire scene that plays on this button layout for Mortal Kombat, and you tell them to either play with this thing, which was the official controller, or this thing, which is supposed to be your way of playing with familiar controls. It's just not going to happen. Arcade users were straight up alienated by the restrictions that heightened the barrier of entry. So you have the more hardcore competitive community pretty much unable to play Trilogy comfortably. So they stuck to Ultimate MK3, which was everywhere and you knew that you liked it already. The idea of accessibility these days is easy to work around. There's a converter for everything. Emulation tends to mean you can play whatever you want on whatever you want, but back then, no such luck. But now we've got the initial trouble out there, let's move on to the actual mechanical side. When people ask about Trilogy, they generally tend to assume that Trilogy is Ultimate MK3 with more content. But that's definitely not true, and it all comes down to the technical stuff. This game is a different game entirely, and it plays like its own new inclusion. The most immediate to point out is the frame rate. Classic arcade MK plays at about 54 frames per second. Trilogy plays at 60. This results in a much faster game in general, almost like Turbo Ultimate MK3. This speed difference is extremely noticeable, and it already makes the game feel like a new thing. It is simply put, just faster. Secondly, performance. Both main versions of Trilogy, being the N64 and PlayStation, had their own pretty severe drawbacks. N64, being the more limited of the two, had inconsistent performance. When it was smooth, it was fine, but the game felt and still feels rather unstable when you play it. I mentioned this choppy performance. It makes execution characters harder to play, like Reptile, for instance, in my competitive history of Reptile. But the reality is, N64 just doesn't run amazingly well. Ultimate MK3 on arcade does, and that's all there is to it. The PlayStation version isn't unstable, but oh my god, the load times! They were outrageous, and just loading up the game took longer than most. Navigating through all of the options to change the Shang Tsung morphs to limited so that he didn't have to load every single time, trying to cut out all of the character select and versus screen stuff that could cause it to take a lot longer than it should. Again, not the most accessible thing in the world, is it? But if we boot up Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 and choose a mode, we're good to go. Ultimate MK3 wins in this department yet again. On the subject of MKT and Ultimate MK3 being different games, Each of the two main console versions has their own things that, once again, completely change the game. PlayStation is more simple. Aggressor may be the new mechanic added to Trilogy, but it doesn't matter because competitive players turn it off. The PlayStation version doesn't have the crazy frame data differences that N64 does, so it does play more like Ultimate than the N64 version. But there is a critical bug that can occur when Aggressor is turned off. Sometimes, one of the two players gets the damage increase of Aggressor permanently. The only way to fix this bug is to switch off the entire system and start again. Now that is a huge problem. N64 had much more differences. I just mentioned the difference in frame data, and what I mean by that is actually a bit complicated. To make the game fit on a cartridge, they had to cut a lot of things out of the game or alter it heavily. One of those things was the actual sprites themselves. Animations are missing a lot of those sprites that exist in other versions of Trilogy or Ultimate, and it results in a difference of frame data. Sweeps, low kicks, and low punches are all a lot more plus than they are in other games, even other versions of Trilogy, in fact. The recovery and speed of some of these buttons is much more generous because of how many sprites were taken out of the game to make the thing fit in the first place. Having pokes that are plus on hit and better on block completely flips the meta of other versions of Trilogy and Ultimate MK3, because now, a successful poke doesn't just interrupt pressure, it gives you offense afterwards. Some consider it an expanded version of playing the game, and others consider it a buggy interception that wasn't intended and breaks the spirit of what Ultimate MK3 is. But my point here is that it is a very, very different game indeed. Removing sprites to make space also created a situation that broke some characters. Crouched high kick infinites on some of the cast now exist, which, come on, it's all kinds of busted. On a more basic level, the N64 version of this game is just not really that appealing. It's an ugly game. It barely looks better than the 16-bit ports of Ultimate. The music is not only dreadful and compressed beyond all repair, but it's wrong. Stages often have the wrong soundtrack attached, which just gives a real feeling of not giving a damn about the game that you're making. Missing frames of animation is jarring, it feels off. Yes, it changes the mechanics, and maybe you'll like those mechanical changes more, but it's an obvious side of things being cut out of the game that just makes it feel choppy. The inconsistent performance doesn't help matters when you factor this in as well. Human ninjas have basically zero cooldown time on their teleports, so they can be all kinds of crazy in matches, either in the neutral or in combos. Trilogy added a bunch of new moves which helped some characters out. Now I'm not going to list all of them here because I did go over them in depth for my Trilogy episode of MK Meta, but to name some prominent ones, Scorpion gets a forward teleport on top of his regular one, which is massive. Sector's double missile is another big one. Sector on N64 Trilogy is his best classic appearance by far. It's not all bad, but it's very different. Again, a completely different game. But finally, about the game itself, we can't ignore one of the main areas, and I don't know, maybe you've been waiting for it. Broken characters. We're going to start with a brief overview of the PlayStation versions, as N64 was missing the retro characters like MK1 Raiden and Kano, MK2 Jax, etc. Basically, all of these characters were just added to the game, and it didn't feel like they were tested that much, because some of them were crazy strong and easy as hell. MK2 Kung Lao having ridiculous chip damage, launch potential, mobility, Raiden Superman for crying out loud, MK2 Jax being a zoning beast, which is funny to me because MK3 Jax was a broken zoner that had to be nerfed in Ultimate MK3. These characters are mad weird and don't really feel like Ultimate MK3 characters at all, which is strange considering Trilogy builds on Ultimate MK3. Feels almost Mugen-like user-created content or something. Male and female Chameleon were both unreliable in high level, so it's not worth mentioning them here, although I have covered them extensively in competitive history. I do want to discuss the two more standout and memorable examples, and yes, I've been saving them for last. Starting with the lesser of two evils, Rain had an infinite off of his kick string or either of his two projectiles. He hits you, you could lose the round. That is crazy strong, but it is kind of hard to do at first. An infinite isn't infinite though. Rain has it, and he's one of the best characters in the game because of it. Noob Saibot, on the other hand, is a different story entirely. He was a walking infinite because of his teleport slam, and he could get it from any touch, as he had a good launcher as a string, a launching clone toss, and a launching teleport. What made this worse is that his Ghost Ball stops the opponent from blocking or being able to connect any attacks. Combine this with your infinite potential, both figuratively and literally, I guess, he is absolutely out of this world broken, and Noob Saibot is generally banned from every Trilogy tournament that has ever taken place. Noob Saibot's Infinite works on both versions, but the Infinite has to be done a little differently. High Punch on N64, and High Punch Low Punch on the disc releases. But that's another thing, isn't it? On PlayStation, it seems that his walk speed is faster, so that's another major issue right there. We could play Trilogy, I guess, but which one are we talking about here? Even MK Trilogy is not consistent by itself. The PlayStation and, I suppose, disc versions of Trilogy seems a little bit like Ultimate MK 3.5, and the N64 version is its own beast entirely. Which one do you play? So, from frame rate to performance to frame data to weird roster additions and more, Trilogy is a fun Mortal Kombat game in its own right. But if you're an Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 player, Trilogy doesn't quite scratch that itch at times, and it just doesn't feel like the same game, because it isn't. Now, to give Trilogy its competitive credit, South America has always had an extremely console-focused Classic MK community, and they have possibly the most dedicated Trilogy player base on the planet. You can check out competitive action from the likes of By Speed and find everything that you need to know over on his YouTube. But my point is, the game does have players. This video was not to explain why nobody plays Trilogy, because that isn't true. By the time you could get your console head around MKT though, you had likes of MAME and the Ultimate MK3 Xbox Live Arcade release. So the two communities of console and arcade pretty much merged by that point. However, I do sincerely hope that I've been able to give a little extra insight into why, even to this day, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 is played as the classic standard, and Trilogy isn't. They are not even close to the same game or the same experience. But by all means, play the one that you like, and by all means, it's fair enough. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.